If you are a fan of The West Wing, you may remember an episode where the White House invites people they don't usually see in to see them, to give them feedback and tell them things and ask for things and all that stuff. It allows for a lot of hijinks and whatever, but Leo McGarry, White House Chief of Staff and best friend in the world, compares it to Andrew Jackson's White House, which did similar things by inviting the common man and the populace in to have an audience and whatever. And while they did it, they had a big block of cheese in the middle of everything that people could just come in and, I guess, cut off a piece and walk in and they have cheese. I can't speak to the accuracy of that. I never looked it up and I can't be bothered. But it's a good story. And I want to take some inspiration from that now and spotlight some of y'all's comments. In terms of announcements, it's pretty cool to say. I never thought I would really say it, but we hit a milestone, the first monetization milestone, thanks to all y'all. I can now sell merchandise related to the channel and you guys can join it, become members, and we can have all kinds of stuff. So with all that out of the way, let's now turn it to you guys.
It is in my opinion, and George's, that none of them are to be skipped. All 6 films are made to be essential to each other. 6 parts, 1 film. Much like Tolkien's own book saga in The Lord of the Rings. Multiple parts, 1 book. You cannot have one without the other. Overall, you become the very thing you criticize those who easily dismiss The Phantom Menace. So do be careful when you easily dismiss Attack of the Clones as, quote, not important. Episode 2 is set up as a classic chivalrous/Shakespearean romance with a mystery noir plot in the mix. The point of Dooku was to keep the audience guessing whether he was truly an enemy or villain, or if he was just an opposition leader in the galaxy on the brink of war, which is all there if you either pay attention, listen to George's DVD commentaries, and or watch the behind-the-scenes stuff. Both the dismissals of The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones are easy to counteract. The Clone Wars also helps enrich the prequels, even though they stand fine on their own, while also properly humanizing the clones and making their story and turn all the more tragic.
First off, I think it is kind of funny that you say all 6 films instead of 9 films. I guess that's you saying you would skip the last 3 movies, and I totally agree that the intent of Lucas was to watch all 6 films. Obviously, no author intends for a part of their work to be discarded. I was approaching it from the point of view of being a kind of a fun project. Maybe it was a little cheeky during the video in terms of how you could overlook Attack of the Clones, since Phantom Menace is written off so much. I should clarify, Attack of the Clones was my favorite of the prequels for a long time. In fact, in my follow-up video, I mention as much. And I mentioned that episode 2 actually has the bones to be the best of the saga. And I actually have listened to all the commentaries for those films. I used to listen to them all the time, on repeat. In fact, I featured some of his commentary for that video itself. I totally get what episode 2 is going for. It's a Shakespearean romance, it is an epic war movie, and it is a noir. It has all those things, and it's what I appreciate about it. I won't argue that it does it perfectly. In fact, it's kind of frustrating how much is left on the table and kind of left unsaid. So I'm not ignorant of the commentaries and the behind-the-scenes stuff, and I have watched these movies really closely, as a lot of fans have. And I think it's because we love it that we should feel comfortable talking about how we could twist it, bend stuff, and really play with it. That's what being a fan of Star Wars is playing with the saga. And it's really channeling the spirit of Lucas himself, really taking things out. Like, he himself has taken stuff out of his saga, replaced it with other things just to see how it looks. And I think as fans, we should be okay with doing that ourselves. It's a canvas to paint on and express yourself and be creative.
How I interpret the central theme of Phantom Menace. Sometimes you must take high risks to succeed in life. Padme takes a huge risk, teaming up with the Gungans and the Jedi to defeat the Trade Federation. Interesting argument for why clones could be cut from the lineup. The prequels are flawed, but the overall story is cool, and part of my headcanon for Star Wars.
That's a very interesting theme and a very cool take. I never thought of it like that before. I think there's a ton you can pick out of Phantom Menace. Personally, I think that's the movie Lucas had the most fun writing and took the most time with. Padme does take a huge risk in teaming up with the Gungans. Qui-Gon takes a huge risk in betting it all on Anakin. For that matter, Palpatine takes a huge risk in orchestrating the whole thing himself. And I don't think that was an intent of Lucas himself, but it is really cool how he's given a piece of art that we can all see things, and for the most part, it's valid.
One of my biggest issues with The Force Awakens was the removal of Coruscant, who in deleted scenes worked closely with Leia but dies when Starkiller Base destroys Hosnian Prime. All of her scenes besides her death were removed because they wanted Leia's first scene to be with Han for extra fan service. Thankfully, she's still a major character in Bloodline by Claudia Gray, which is a great Leia political thriller that is a good setup for the sequel era. Another script removal I'm also not a fan of was hiding the implication that Snoke and Hux went behind Kylo's back to make Starkiller Base a planet destroyer. Kylo was supposed to be visually upset seeing the laser fired, but they thought the scene looked cooler if he had a helmet, which left his thoughts on Starkiller Base unknown. Thankfully, this character detail was once again implied in the canon novelization.
I read Bloodline, and Claudia Gray is great. I love Lost Stars. I think she's pretty awesome. I think she's one of the better storytellers of Lucasfilm's orbit since the Disney buyout. I didn't know that character was Corcella, honestly. That much more context in the movie, in that scene, would have been better than what we got now. I think that speaks to a weakness that J.J. Abrams has as a storyteller. And I've gone into this ad nauseum in my videos, and I hate picking on him, but I just can't. I have so much to say. But it's how, like, the act of it all somehow is enough for an audience. Like, you don't need context. By that I mean, apparently his mantra as a storyteller is a world's blowing up doesn't need context, because like, okay, that's enough spectacle to hold you over. What more do you need? What more personal connection do you need? But the thing is, most audiences, especially on subsequent watch-throughs, need more than spectacle.
This is the best video I have seen on someone trying to connect all of the Bond movies together. Sure, like you say in the video, it is impossible to connect them all, but I love your idea that the old Bond movies were Madeline's version of Bond. It even makes the end of No Time to Die more meaningful.
I hope it gives more meaning to the whole run of films too, thinking of them as kind of storybook tales, because that's how a lot of us saw them, right? We saw these movies as kids, and now in our headcanon, they're stories for a child. Of course, you know, you'd have to take some things out in a meta way, like the sexism and stuff.
There's a Tumblr post floating somewhere where someone described a dream they had where a new Bond movie came out and it was a complete mystery on which character was James Bond, and the film was stacked with famous actors, any one of whom could feasibly be James Bond. I forget who ended up being Bond in the dream, but if the next movie is a palate cleanser, I kind of like the idea of the mystery of who the real James Bond is. We go through the movie, everyone thinks Bond is this person or that person, but one by one they get eliminated as the true Bond.
I would actually love to see this. I know a lot of people would not, but I would, if it was just like a one and done thing. And I think we do need a palate cleanser of some kind coming off of Craig. Like, Craig himself had a horrible time after Brosnan, and the next guy will have an even tougher time. And this would be a great way to fulfill our kind of Fantasy League team roster of actors to play Bond. We could kind of have our cake and eat it too. Like, get them all in there, see how they would hypothetically feel as Bond, but not really have the burden of having to carry multiple films and being in the canon.
Brosnan should get a swan song, as an aging Bond who has to rely on his wits and experience, but not bleed quite as much as Craig's.
I totally agree. We've never seen an aged Bond. The closest we've gotten is Skyfall, but I would love for Bond to have his Dark Knight Returns story, and Brosnan would be great for it. He never got his send-off. I get no Bond really has, Craig is the first, but I get the feeling Brosnan really wanted one, and that was what made him different, was his attachment to the character. I think for him it was a bit of a blessing and a curse, but in general I think he is a bit sour in how he was kind of cast aside, and I'd love to set that right. He also said at some point he'd love to play a villain. I would love either one.
So your idea is to dismantle the character completely and create what exactly? Before you answer, however, let us not forget how deconstructing characters is playing out for these folks at the minute.
I'm not sure who you mean by these folks. I assume you mean kind of Hollywood in general or something. It's true that we're kind of reimagining characters nowadays because we're so used to them and they're kind of institutions, and it's like, how do you make it fresh? The show Velma is an example of doing it wrong. I think another example, not as egregious but also fitting, is the Tomb Raider trilogy that was kind of recent. Tomb Raider through Rise through Shadow. The conceit of that first game was, hey, this is how Lara Croft starts. So you expect her to be a little bit different from how you remember. But it made the promise that she's going to be the Tomb Raider that we all know and love by the end. It's her Batman Begins, right? But the problem was, Rise came out and it was kind of more the same, and then Shadow came out. She never really turned into the Tomb Raider that we all knew. It was still a cool character, but didn't sit right with a lot of players. So I think the key to deconstructing a character is to eventually construct them, or at least keep them recognizable and have the spirit of the character you love. And that would be the idea with the Bond I put out here. We crack him open a bit and boil him down to his fundamental qualities, make him more human, and relatable, but he's still the character we know. Same interest and stuff, only he's not infallible, or omniscient, or bulletproof and all that stuff. Like, he'll bleed in ways we bleed and not necessarily bleed in ways like action heroes do. Ideally, taking apart a character reintroduces you and reaffirms what you love about them in the first place, as opposed to kind of trying to convince you that no, you love this character, not that character that you know, you like this one instead.
I loved your prequel videos a lot, and was wondering if you're going to make more Star Wars videos, and here you are with one about KOTOR. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you. I love KOTOR as well. I have for years. In some ways, I love those games more than the movies, and that's saying a lot. It's the first game that I played that I felt lost in. Like, I could inhabit this world, and I was inhabiting this world and not just playing a sprite on a screen. It surprised me with what I could do, and I felt like I created a character who then went on to form bonds and relationships with other characters. It was the first time that I learned about characters in a video game. By that I mean, I had one impression of them first, and then they grew on me, or my impression of them changed as it went. They weren't flat or static. Like, at first I hated Canderous, and then by the end he was my favorite character of them all. It was truly special.
These deserve more views.
Tell me about it.
Games are, of course, art. Not all of them are meant to be art, of course, but there are a lot of games that are clearly art. The Last of Us 1 and 2, God of War, Uncharted. I could name hundreds. I think that as gamers we should fight a little bit. Nothing crazy, but always defend gaming and explaining why it's great. How some games can be more art than a lot of movies, series, music, paintings, etc. Mentalities need to change. People need to be less ignorant.
Totally. I don't know if I would use the word fight. I think gamers, we should be able to debate. The art of debate is kind of going away, it's washing away. And fighting doesn't do much because we don't listen, right? But we should turn over ideas and examine them and say, in this case, what is art? What is valid as art? And do we have anything in the medium of gaming that fits that? Obviously, I think we do, but we also have people who don't. For some reason, it's okay to binge like 8 hours of a show or a movie series, and it's fine. In fact, it's like a buzzword, like marketing uses the word binge. It's encouraged. Like, you go to work on Monday and people are like, I binged this show, it's amazing. But if you play like 3 hours of a game, that's a waste of time.
Video games are entertainment. They are not art.
I would have preferred it if you had laid out specific points as to why entertainment is not art. Like, most art is entertaining if you break it down. Movies, TV shows, paintings, music, all that is meant to entertain and be artistic. Like I say in the video, a lot of our famous art pieces, whether it's paintings or music or whatever, were commissioned at the behest of rich folks who wanted to be entertained. So there's a huge precedent in history for entertainment being art pieces and speaking to people on a deeper level.
The limitations of technology in these games are 100% integral to their nostalgia now, to the point people have to struggle to recreate the same ambiance. I wonder how many of the jerky aspects that we loved about these old games were completely unintentional and frustrated the programmers who were trying to make an experience as smooth and flawless as they could. I hope they're happy to see that those limitations are part of what we all fell in love with.
It is kind of funny how those aspects of the workflow that plagued the developers and maybe kept them up at night and were seen as flaws are now more of a feature than a bug, and they're a source of nostalgia for a huge swath of the player base. And you're right, people do try to recreate that ambience, but it's hard because once you overcome a limitation which these developers had, it's hard to go back and pretend you still have them.
As a little kid, I always found games like this scary because they felt so big and mysterious. I felt like there was so much more happening behind the game that I could never see. It was an uncertain kind of unease, like not knowing what's making a weird noise at night.
That's a great way to put it. I think I felt the same. I would never have phrased it like that. It was the lack of context in a lot of those games paired with being a kid and not understanding a lot of it anyway. That left a lot of blank spaces, a lot of dark corners that with such a vivid imagination you fill with just the craziest stuff anyway. You look at old games now and they seem very small, but at the time they felt very big, very cavernous, and you were scared about getting lost in them, as if booting up certain games felt like getting farther and farther away from the shore.
Without getting too controversial, at least part of the psychological concept stems from the same reason you showed gameplay footage when mentioning older games and movie footage when mentioning newer games. I'm a little older, so I experienced most of the kind of thing you seem to be describing more with some Nintendo and Atari games than I did for games for the Super Nintendo or Nintendo 64 or PlayStation. Either way, I think part of what it comes down to is the phenomenological context and awareness. Newer games have long cutscenes, behind-the-scenes internet campaigns, and a much better understood production process, all of which make aspects of the interactive story more clear. While I do mean in terms of the characters on the game on screen, I also mean in terms of the characters who created the content on the screen. Players today have a more direct pipeline of awareness running to their brain from every aspect of a game experience, even meta elements. It's extremely clear what Arthur or Master Chief's drives, feelings, and intentions are when we play those games. We also know how everything on the screen came to be there, and in most cases, who put it there and why. We know these things not only because there's more behind-the-scenes understanding, but because games aim for a more one-to-one representational experience than the more symbolic and surreal representation used by older games. We didn't know much about who made them, how they were made, or, due to their symbolic, surreal representational nature, why they were made the way they were. Old games just existed in a surreal and unknowable space. The more symbolic and analogous a game had to be, the more surreal it felt, the creepier or more unsettling it was. The disconnect also ironically allowed an elevated sense of responsibility over the characters. Does Samus really want to run around this ship? Does Mario really want to go down this dark pipe? Are they scared? Upset? Not knowing made controlling them a little more real. You can get a lot of it from much older arcade-style games with black backgrounds and symbolic character sprites. Because of all this, older games can feel like some kind of coded communication from a lost or alien entity, indecipherable, uncanny, and largely unknowable. They feel like fading echoes from no place, still perceptible to no one discernible. They're electronic ghosts, driven far too mad by incorporeal reality to know their cries to the living no longer make sense. There's a longing loneliness to them you could feel at the time. There's a kind of confused sadness on the edge of creepiness to all that.
Yep.
Oh man,
I'm just kidding. But to really dive deep into this and answer this as well as it deserves probably takes a whole video in of itself. Like I said before, the lack of context in older games really fed that sense of dread, and is hard to replicate now because developers and storytellers in general, once they have the tools to give more context, they're going to use them. Why would you fight with one hand behind your back, or paint with one hand behind your back? You would think on its face that having more control would help you build more of what you want. But in this case, giving more context and telling someone how scary something is, or what somebody feels how scared they are, actually is counterproductive. Because to scare an audience, you need to instill a fear of mystery and unknowableness.
Oh man, when I was 3, I was frozen for 10 minutes straight when I booted up Jurassic Park on the Sega Genesis, until my mother came into the room and turned it off.
I really hope you're not being hyperbolic. I kind of love the image of a little kid being frozen for 10 minutes straight on, like, the startup screen to this game, like, oh my god, what's going on? Props to your mother for taking charge. I kind of want to know if you came back to that game later.
Seems like you need to be introduced to the pixel horror genre of indie games. Titles like Corpse Party, The Witch's House, etc. There are many reasons those games are still so effective at creeping you out, and their old-school sprite-based presentation that skirts the line between 8-bit and 16-bit aesthetic certainly is among them.
I really do love that genre. In fact, I'm kind of being introduced to it more and more as time goes on. I downloaded, I think, the Count Lucanor, I think is what it's called, and that's very much in that style, that horror, like 16-bit, 8-bit style. I didn't get very far on it, but actually I think it'd be a great game to play like on stream or something. In fact, that may be a great subcategory of the channel, maybe streams specifically of playing these kind of more dark, off-kilter, creepy, older style games. I think that'd be really fun.
Black Sheep movie. Probably Final Fantasy, The Spirits Within, or Reign of Fire.
Good Black Sheep movies right there, really solid. I remember seeing Final Fantasy Spirits Within in the theater, loved it a lot. I imagine it doesn't hold up as much now. Reign of Fire was great. I mean, what a premise. You know, dragons in a post-apocalyptic world. I would love a remake of that, frankly, or maybe a remake in the form of a game.
This movie was so frustrating to me. I wanted so much to love it, but it just annoyed me to no end.
Right, it is so frustrating. Prometheus, like, when you go to watch it, or like when you're looking at it on like Amazon Prime, you think like, oh, this movie was great, right? I must have forgotten. But then you get like half an hour in and you remember like, oh, this movie is actually... It's wearing the coat of a amazing, well-done cinematic film, but inside it's like a Netflix original.
I'm almost 40 now. I've been waiting since 2001 for a good adaptation.
And I hope we get one, honestly. At the very least, I hope this show becomes good, like really good. Season 2 was off to a better start than Season 1 was at this point, and I hope the show becomes one of those, like, by Season 3 it's amazing. You don't see that too often anymore because streaming services are really quick to cancel shows that aren't a hit after Season 1 or 2. but Halo's saving grace might be its being on Paramount Plus, because even it being what it is, Paramount does not have much to draw people in, and so it might not cut it loose just for that fact.
1000% agree. The series did not live up to the expectations. I grew up playing Halo, and it was easily one of my absolute favorite games. I was so disappointed in the series. Nothing like the game in my opinion. I disliked it so much I couldn't even get past the second episode. I don't know much of the lore, but every other point y'all made hit the nail on the head of my experience. I really wanted to love it, but sadly I couldn't get over the story just seeming like it wasn't even Halo.
I know that feeling with other stuff too. Like, you really want to love it, you've been waiting for a long time for it, it just doesn't run on all cylinders. Especially in the case of season 1 of Halo. It just doesn't feel right. It feels like this other show that's wearing the mask of Halo. Actually, in a lot of cases, not wearing a mask of Halo, which is a problem. I get that adapting a game to a movie or a show is not an easy one-to-one thing, but the key to it being successful, like, you can change things like The Last of Us did, like the details, but the maintaining of the spirit and the relationships between characters is what's going to make it feel good and cohesive, right? And it's a shame that the writer's room didn't seem to either get or think it was important to maintain those things. It's like they were saying, we're going to make a good Halo show in spite of the game. And that's it for this block of cheese. I hope you liked it. Like I said earlier, I hope to do this more. As usual, grab a like on your way out, sub if you haven't, and as weird as it feels to say now, take a look at the merch store. For now, stay tough and stop by again sometime.